Afternoon, everyone. I think we can start our panel discussion today. I'm very excited to have all of you join us here today for a very engaging discussion on mobilization of green energy for the energy transition. I'm Anthony, and I'm a first-year student of international business here at Fletcher, and this is my colleague.
Good afternoon. I'm Manjulika Das. I'm a first-year MGA student here at Fletcher, focusing on international development and environmental policy.
Yeah, and just a bit of a housekeeping note. So for our discussion today, it's going to be about an hour, and the panel discussion will be 45 minutes, and then there'll be some Q&A session at the end of about 15 minutes. I would like to pass on to Seth, our moderator.
All right. Thanks, guys, for the introduction, and thanks for the good job in putting this panel together. And hi, everyone. Thank you very much for making time for this session, Mobilizing Finance for the Energy Transition, Opportunities, Risks, and Solutions. So the US, as we all know, is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters, with the largest source of carbon dioxide coming from the energy sector, combustion of fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. Now, a shift to clean energy solutions or sustainable energy solutions will require, we just talked about technologies, will require regulations, but how about financing? Financing is very crucial. But where does the US stand as far as financing of the energy transition is concerned? Are there financing gaps? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the solutions? And what are the risks? So these and many more, some of the questions we'll be dealing with on this particular panel. And I'm privileged to introduce our panelists. On my immediate right, Mr. John Harper, Executive Managing Director and Partner of Clean Energy Venture Group. And thanks for having us. Do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Turn on the microphone. Is this on? Can you hear me? Great. So, hi, welcome. Thank you for inviting me. As Seth said, I am the Executive Managing Director of Clean Energy Venture Group. This is a group of angel investors, about 45 of us. We got our start about 2005. We're based here in the Boston area, but courtesy of the pandemic, we're now spread across the countryside. Our focus is on early stage clean tech companies. We invest in early rounds, seed rounds, Series A type of area across multiple different sectors. My own background is previously I was a project finance guy working on that for several decades, renewable power projects for about 20 years. And before that, a lot of international infrastructure projects in about 30 different emerging markets. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Next to him is Greg Ken, Managing Director of CSK Energy Solutions. Greg.
Good afternoon. How's everyone? Excellent. My name is Gregory King. I'm the Managing Director of TSK Energy Solutions. We're a Black-owned consultancy located in Cambridge, Mass. And unlike everyone else on the panel, my work is really focused more around environmental justice and equity. And it's really about recognition that it's going to take about, according to McKinsey & Company, it's going to take about $265 trillion in capital to decarbonize transportation, buildings, power generation, and agriculture. So it's an economic development opportunity of a lifetime. And so a lot of my work's been focused on how do we create systems to make environmental justice communities more bankable. So we'll be talking more about that work and how it intersects with the need for an equitable transition.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. And next is Heather Tucker, President and CEO of Power Options. Heather.
Thanks, great so much. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay? Is this thing on? Great to see a full room here and to be invited into Fletcher. I have some ties similar to Kevin when he was speaking earlier. Member of Power Options Board is Bobby Cates Garnick. Long time, I think the longest standing board member. Also, full disclosure, this one is a board member as well. I'm very thankful to our board. So I've been in the clean energy sector for nearly 2 decades now. Came into it for the mission. And really have a background across my experience really on the customer side, distributed scale, clean energy across technologies. I call myself technology agnostic, mission driven. And so I get to see from the consumer end, or what I usually call the end energy user end, more on the CNI or than the residential side of what their needs are and what motivates them, which includes financing. And I think you'll hear my comments today speaking from that side. But currently, the CEO and president of Power Options, we are a women-run nonprofit started by the state in Massachusetts, but now a standalone entity that serves the needs of other nonprofits. We're essentially an energy buying consortium is where we started, group procurement for nonprofits and public entities across Massachusetts. We also now serve Rhode Island and Connecticut and even going beyond. And so we'll speak from that perspective as well today.
Great, thank you. And next is Stephen Lee, Green New Deal Finance Advisor for the City of Boston. Stephen?
Hi, thank you, Seth. A pleasure to be with all of you and with my fellow panelists. Thank you very much for having me. I'm with the City of Boston's climate team. I joined recently full-time as of November. Prior to joining the city, I worked in private finance for my entire career, both in the bond markets as a bond manager here locally in Boston with John Hancock Life, as well as a angel investor in both impact, sustainability, and climate tech. And so great to be part of the discussion today. I'm with the Green New Deal team, which is Mayor Wu's vision for the Green New Deal. When she came into office, she created this new unit, which works across the entire city with every single department and agency to bring together the City of Boston's vision for addressing social, economic, and racial inequities. And my particular role for the Green New Deal team is focused on financing and funding strategies, and happy to share some of that work today.
Great, and thanks all again for joining us. So we'll spend the next 40 to 45 minutes doing the talking here, and after that, we'll open up for your comments, questions, and opinions on any of the issues we discuss. So my first question, and it's across board, I mean, all of you could have a bite on it. So for the US as a developed economy, one will expect the mobilization of finance for the energy transition to be a fairly straightforward process, but it appears not to be the case. What are the challenges what challenges are we dealing with here? Is there a financing gap? How large is this gap? And then what are some of the untapped opportunities, associated with financing the energy transition in the US? It's a loaded question, but just take it up from whoever makes it comfortable or okay for you. Maybe I'll start with you, Stephen. We can look at it from the perspective of the City of Boston.
Sure. So great question. Naturally, we are spending a lot of time thinking through these issues of financing gaps. I think from the city's perspective, we are working closely with our partners both at the federal and state level. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, there's certainly a lot of focus on the Inflation Reduction Act. Naturally, there are specific programs as part of IRA that are designed specifically for municipalities to be working with their partners at the state level. So City of Boston is spending a lot of energy trying to dissect some of these programs. I think in the way they're designed, we can get into the details later on, but high level, the way they're designed is meant to create incentives to help cities and states co-invest in new technologies as well as proven technologies in order to access the loan guarantees or loans from the US government. The state of Massachusetts, to its credit, last year also created a green bank, a Massachusetts Community Climate Bank, which I read Seth's article on last year, which really highlights the need for state level governments to co-invest in the de-risking of a lot of these energy technologies. So City of Boston is very much focused on trying to identify these partners, public partners, because as you're all aware, as significant as Inflation Reduction Act is, ultimately it is still, I think, a tiny part of ultimately the need to unlock private capital markets. And so I think the good work of, Greentown Labs and the capital that is coming from, private sector angels such as John and the Clean Energy Venture Group, those are critical components to a very complex capital stack that needs to be built, needs to be created, bringing together, not just the venture capital, but also the many other layers of capital required, particularly for some of these very complex, expensive upfront capital cost technologies. And so the city of Boston is trying to identify some of these different, public capital partners, ultimately to be able to access private capital. So I'll get into some of the examples later on.
Yeah, and I'll ask you a few follow-up questions on that.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in. When we talk about, the financing gap, I think one of the things we have to really recognize is that we also have a significant racial income gap. And that income gap, really affects ability of families to access, capital, credit and capital and incentives. Recently, the National Realtors Association published a report that the gap between white household income and Black household incomes increased from 2012, where it's about 22,000, to 2022, where it's probably closer to 30,000. So we're literally going backwards when it comes to the racial wealth gap. And so a lot of what I see in terms of gaps are the reality that low-income communities have historically not been bankable. There are lots of environmental challenges there because of where zoning and where power plants have been sited. This is a whole basis for the environmental justice community. And what we really have to recognize is that in order for investments to flow into these communities, we sort of have to start systematically addressing some of the foundational problems with the racial wealth gap. And also the reality that, traditional financing is built on, return, internal rate of return mentality. And so what I've been doing is working on a new framework called the impact rate of return that was developed by Professor Howard Buffett, and applying that to EJ communities, where we're looking to try to put different kinds of energy projects and evaluate them on the basis of the impact they create in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, in an effort to try to convince social impact investors that by quantifying impact, we can actually create a new mechanism for investments to flow. Because otherwise, there are these communities that have been historically underinvested will remain underinvested, and the gaps, as they continue to increase, will only continue to increase. So we're on a trajectory that is not favorable, and so there needs to be intervention for us to reverse those trends.
Heather?
Yeah, and I'll add and pick up on that. I love the framework that Greg has talked about and working on. And one of the needs, the gap is, investing works well, financing works well in the US historically because there's a return for the investor, right? And that return has been an economic return. And the challenge is, the gap is that there are not economic returns in a lot of these technologies, whether it be existing technologies, call it heat pump, even solar, distributed solar, at least these days, or new technologies. There are some great innovation coming out of Greentown Labs and others, but those new technologies don't have a market to sell into because there's not an economic return for the energy end user. So ultimately, if the markets don't exist, then the financing won't come to the table. There is a plethora of dollars out there. I can't tell you how many financiers I've talked to. $1 billion plus was just raised by Generate Capital as one of the biggest investors for project-based financing. There's loads of VC capital starting to come to the table now again for company and new technology, but they don't have any place to put that funding when the economics don't ultimately makes sense for an individual project or an individual market. And so that's where our real gap is. And importantly, of course, as Greg is highlighting, it's going to be underscored and challenged continued in the environmental justice communities, but across the board, the same goes. Impact investors, I like to say, and sometimes I get in trouble by saying this, but impact investors, I'm just learning that's not, it's a little bit of a misnomer, I'll say, or it came up how it came up. It came up in the 80s because investors were saying, I want to do good with my investment and not invest in tobacco and into the bad stuff. But because they started that way, they were still looking for market-based returns. So impact investing, actually, I like to say, they want their cake and eat it too, or whatever that expression is, right? They want market-based returns plus have an impact, which is a real challenge in itself. One or either of those is challenging, rather than what I thought it was lower returns at a concession because they're getting the impact instead of just a pure market investment. If you want a market investment, go invest in, in equities, right? But so what I've learned, by the way, that the actual terminology for the investors and the impact investing community is called concessionary capital. And some on the panel might know and understand that better than I do. So I'm just learning this terminology. But there are some amount of concessionary capital, but hopefully it will grow when you have things like the impact rate of return that measures not just the economic return, but I think there are a lot of investors out there that are willing to, if they were sold on what the actual return will be. Impact is very hard to measure. So if we have a great framework for measurement, I will concur with Greg that hopefully will turn the tide for investors in both technology as well as project-based financing.
Great. And then John?
So the notion of a financing gap is very tricky to say because there's different sectors, as we've talked about. There's the financing for individual homeowners if they want a solar panel array on the roof or they want a heat pump in their basement. You have municipal type of situations. Then you have utility scale. The IRA is really, really good at hoping to amass capital for industrial scale, if you will, utility scale type of projects. The amount of money now going into renewable power projects, solar projects, wind power projects is just increasing orders of magnitude on a regular basis. And it's not just the traditional sources, the banks and the life insurance companies who invested tax-oriented in capital. There's a whole notion within the financing world here that the tax incentives of the federal government are a huge driver of capital going into utility scale projects. And there's a whole class of investors called tax equity investors, which are investing in projects to reap the benefits of those tax structures. It's a structure that was worked out, call it 20 years ago. I wrote papers on this for NREL and for Lawrence Berkeley Labs when the early days of getting it going. Those structures are set. The reason why capital flows to the utility scale is predictability, repeatability. We have a rule of law in this country that people respect a 20-year contract, by and large. Go back to earlier nuclear phases, that may not be the case. But by and large, someone signs an agreement to buy the power for 20 years. Everyone agrees on what the rules are. And those contracts are pretty routinized now. Separately, with renewable power, you're putting all the money in up front. And then you're hoping to get it back over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years, depending on the length of the contract. You have to believe that the system's going to work and that you're going to get your money back and a return on your money during that time period. The system is set up that way. The tax incentives under the IRA were just expanded from where they were. Again, predictability. Investors like predictability. They like the ability to move large amounts of money. There are private sector infrastructure funds that are going up. Generate Capital, as you mentioned, just raised $1 billion. That money came from shops that have more money than they know what to do with and not enough people. This room is what, I don't know, 50 people here. The typical staff of a life insurance company that's investing in renewable power, 3, maybe 2. I was an advisor to one of them and they had sort of 1.5 person and they just outsourced it. So they have to move large amounts of money. Again, that's what helps utility scale projects. Where it gets into trouble, the greater difficulties as you scale downward, because then you're moving away from standardized project structures, top of the line companies that are knowing what they're doing. They've been doing it forever. You start getting into one-offs. Each of you has lived in different houses. You know that those houses are different. The heating system is in a different location. The roof line looks different. The age of the equipment is different. The electrical systems, those are different. Maybe you have a socket in the right location and probably not, and you have wires all over your floor. I lived in this housing. 47 Winthrop Street was my house because I went to Fletcher. It looks a lot better now than it did. Every house is unique. Every installation is unique. There's a good reason why it's hard to put money into heat pumps because it goes into a different closet or a different basement in every single house. Solar, it goes on the roof. It's more standardized. Those challenges make it hard to move large amounts of money. And then you have the credit profile, the likelihood that someone is going to be able to pay you back over time differs. That's where programs like Power Options come into play, municipal programs come into play, utility programs come into play, to move it away from the one-offs to an aggregate, a pool. Because on average, people pay the utility bills. If you can aggregate it, one, it allows more money, and two, you get a standardized program along the way. So that's the challenge we face, is not so much where do we find the money? The money's there. It's making it possible for investors to move that money into programs that offer repeatability, predictability, and a likelihood they're going to get their money back over time.
Yeah, building on that theme of utility scale investing, we do have, structural problems in so much as if you think about the whole idea of decarbonizing. I often tell people you can't efficiency your way to zero. So here in Massachusetts, we have a lot of programs that are being funded by ratepayers, like our Mass Save program or the Solar Smart program. These programs are very siloed. They're not well integrated. And in order for, the typical community or homeowner to be able to decarbonize their environments, we have to consider mixing energy efficiency along with demand response and along with, on-site renewables. And so there are lots of regulatory barriers that exist because the way our systems have evolved over time, again, has been built around a technology as opposed to the solution of decarbonizing. And so we need to kind of recognize that we have to decompose some of these systems that exist today that make it difficult for communities or homeowners to access the benefits that might be locked into these various different incentives. And I would certainly concur with the comments that the IRA is a game changer. There are bonus tax credits for low income and for paying prevailing wages and for a lot of different use cases that are quite attractive in terms of trying to attract money into historically underserved communities. But again, the structure and the complexity of the way people have to access these programs and the funds, and also in some cases, that we have challenges with the way incentives are designed because of potentially too much ambition. Think about electric vehicles. Well, in order to get the tax credit for electric vehicles, you really have to, there's this domestic content component. And so the policymakers were thinking, okay, we're going to create this incentive. We're going to try to bring manufacturing back to the United States, which is great, except try to find a vehicle that meets those standards. And that's when you really start to see, the challenge around incentives design. So we have, to recognize, to unlock some of the money that's in the system, we have to kind of reimagine the system and redesign it.
Yeah, Heather, and let me come to you. You spoke about the lack of market for many of these clean energy technologies, and I know Power Options is working within the space. How are you working to bring, the markets closer to the technology, so for the inventors of these technologies? And how do we get, create a large-scale market to be accessible by everyone?
Yeah, I'll have to thank my colleague and co-panelist here, John, for the plug on Power Options and getting ahead there. Exactly is why Power Options began back in 1998, was to pull together the buying power. So to address some of those concerns as he was talking about at the distributed scale, being able to pull financing in all of our programs and how we have historically gone out to procurement. We are essentially procuring for financing at the same time. And our original programs, which are electric and gas contracting, very boring, old school, just get the energy to the consumer, to the customer. It came with financing, right? Because it was a cents per kilowatt hour or a dollar per decatherm cost that essentially a supplier is financing that power, that energy to get to the end user. But fast forward to the more exciting stuff and what we're here and talking about in 2010, Power Options did that same model for group procurement for solar energy. And so that allowed financiers to come bid in for what is now turned into over 85 megawatts of solar we've developed since 2010. I think largely in Massachusetts, that makes us one of the largest developers. We're not quite a developer, but something like that. That's a large amount of megawatts. It's not as much as I think, what do we have, 3 gigawatts now in Massachusetts, and we need to get to 10, but so we're small on that scale, but it is still for a developer, for a supplier of one of these technologies, we'll call it. It worked for solar, and it brought financing in a very streamlined approach to procurement, solicitation, and allowing the developer to bring financing to the table at scale where it might be harder, and importantly, bring that cost of capital down. So, financing can happen on an individual residential, that's Sunruns of the world selling you on a cents per kilowatt hour. So they do bring it to lower levels, but it comes at a higher cost. They're getting returns of probably 15 to 20% in the early days, if not more, where we've driven down with this group procurement model, driven down the cost of capital to the single digits where it should be as it's a proven technology. So we did that for solar, and we're also doing that with clean transportation in the world of EV charging and fleet electrification as a service, and bringing financing together and trying to entice the suppliers of those services but in bringing financing with them. So that's how we've done it. But I have to tell you something, it works really well for commercialized technologies, this group procurement, where we have, you can look at entire consortium of 500 plus members and the scale that they come with in terms of total volume. It works when it's a technology that does apply easily to across that entire consortium, like solar, EV charging, and fleet electrified vehicles will do. But when we start to get into more niche technologies or more things that are harder to group procure, like microgrids, we often get asked about, although we will try, until they become a technology that is really applicable at scale. It's a harder model, but we continue to try to think about how can we do that even in a more bespoke fashion. But working right now with Mass Clean Energy Center and Greentown Labs and NECEC on how do we make it easier to what we call de-risk technologies for municipalities. And part of that is a little bit of thinking about procurement. Can we create an innovative model for making and streamlining procurement for the early stage technologies when the technology is not quite up the TRL, the commercialization of maturity curve. So we continue to think about that as Power Options, but hopefully a model that we can take forward and use further in decarbonization generally. Building decarbonization is our next procurement coming out this year. So trying to take that across more technologies.
Okay. John, you spoke about the fact that money is not the issue as far as financing is concerned. It's about the predictability that the investor is able to know that my money, I'm going to get my returns, on the investment. How do we ensure that across board, from large scale utility down to residential customers? How do we ensure the predictability of investment for investors? And for the investors, you mentioned maybe a whole insurance company could have only 3 people working within their sustainable investment department. Do they also need to reform their approach and thinking as to how they deal with investing in the clean energy transition?
2 different questions. If we're looking at the municipality level, and this is, again, one of the great strengths of Power Options, towns in Massachusetts, for example, are obliged to put out for competitive procurement whenever they put in a long-term contract. That's fine, except if you don't have the staff to run the procurement or you don't have the expertise to run the procurement, it becomes a barrier to entry. You can't get the transaction done. Or if it's just too hard. I mean, there's so many different things. In my town, there's one person who's in charge of doing all that work. There is no way he has the time to run procurements. Power Options benefited from a quirk, a legacy of, if you go with Power Options, you don't have to do a procurement because they did the procurement on the town's behalf. So that speeds time. So I'm actually on the other side of the table from Heather and her developers on 2 different projects where we're negotiating a standardized contract. We're able to get to that table because that regulation in effect was waived, codified under state law. it's that sort of invisible barrier is the challenge, is identifying what those barriers are to, and seeing what you can do creatively. At its heart, renewable power is very straightforward. It generates electrons predictably with a curve. You can all look at the curves. And during the daytime, leap year, late day. And investors, engineers, people know how much power is going to be generated by that system. It's very straightforward. Because of that's predictable, it's more a sense of, and also I should say, most people pay their utility bills. On average, people will pay the utility bills. So you can combine those in the aggregate to remove the uncertainties about having to look at individual one by ones. The reality is we are not going to move the needle in terms of a global climate change if we're financing one by one houses. It's just not going to get there. It may help that homeowner, and that's important. But if your perspective from a policy perspective, you have to devise systems that you can aggregate, you can scale up, that impact a lot of houses. And that means predictability. It means removing the hassle of trying to evaluate individual customers. You have to have programs that can look at it in the aggregate. That's where utilities come to play. That Massachusetts is in the forefront compared with many other states in the country or public utility commissions in maintaining the utilities move this forward. But there's still more that could be done. For instance, utilities could be mandated to do more in heat pumps. That's something that they have the aggregated power. They have the ability to collect ratepayer money, spread the costs of the inefficiencies across everybody. That's a social goal. So how do we do that? It's more you working through the regulatory system of getting people installed in the public utility commissions or Department of Public Utilities to move those policies forward. Sometimes they'll say, oh, well, that's not our mandate. Then you have to go back to the law. What is the law establishing the role of the DPU? Do they have a mandate to take into account decarbonization? Well, if you get the law passed, then you can get the regs in place, then you get the people in place, then you get the financing mandates. So it's all of a piece. It's a matter of looking at those different structures. So,
And how about on the side of the institutional investors or the capital providers? Do they need to reform their kind of operations?
I think that's a lesser problem. As I mentioned earlier, infrastructure funds are interested in moving this money. They like the returns from renewable power projects. They're very steady. If you're a life insurance company, you're trying to develop returns so that you can pay out on those life insurance policies 20, 25 years from now. You want predictability. They love renewable power. It's predictable. So it's just enabling them to invest in projects. The industry is scaling up, going longer terms. The projects themselves getting larger. The infrastructure funds want to move money. They develop relationships. The worst thing in the world for a developer is to be the new kid on the block and says, I've got a great project. The financiers say, yeah, but I would rather go with Sam because he's delivered 5 other projects and he's proven that he can deliver projects that work for me. Why wouldn't I go finance Sam's 6th project instead of taking a chance on your first project? So it's that predictability. And that's why you're getting a lot of developers who are scaling up. They do more and more projects. They acquire other smaller developers. So it's less an issue than it is getting the systems right on the ground level. If the developers can create the projects, which they are, the financiers will follow because they've got a mandate to move that money.
Yeah.
I would
Okay,
love to just chime in
Okay.
on that point. Having worked for an insurance company's investment department on the bond side, I can certainly concur with John's comments. There is certainly a deep pool of infrastructure project finance capital globally that exists for this asset class. I think being able to express investment opportunities in the form that they're familiar with is what is the challenge. And I think when people are thinking about, financing gaps for climate and climate tech, I think there's a lot of headlines about, early stage venture capital. And no doubt it's extremely important to bring early stage venture into the mix. But that is just the first step of the journey towards, the entire capital stack to the back end of infrastructure finance. So those two worlds of venture capital and infrastructure capital are completely different worlds. And it's trying to bridge, risk capital from one end to the other. That is part of the opportunity and the challenge. And so I think insurance companies, to the point of insurance companies, they represent a significant opportunity to build relationships and partnerships with not just on their investment side, but also on their liability side, on their underwriting of the energy transition. I think there is a growing recognition that insurers, both property and casualty for sure, given a lot of focus on insurance companies pulling out of certain markets across the country on homeowners insurance and commercial property insurance. I believe that there is a significant opportunity to bring the insurance industry into, I think, an active role in helping with the energy transition, both assets, liabilities, risk management.
Okay, I'll come back to ask you a specific question on the IRA and the opportunities it creates. But Heather, I realized you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the right timing, so steer me off if not, but just I was picking up and thinking about the question that you had for John. I was laying it out. There's three different types of capital that we're really talking about here. Sorry, probably four. There's just market-based capital, which we talked about before. But the gap is because the economics don't work. And so when the economics work, there's three other types of capital that I'm thinking that we are talking about. I mentioned one, concessionary capital, just lower base market-based return. So you plug some of that economic gap just by having a lower return on the capital. But that's not going to get you all the way there. Even the 0% mass save financing sometimes doesn't quite get you there, right? To make it a better economic choice for the homeowner, for the building owner, et cetera. So the other two types of capital that we have that need to be deployed are market-based capital, which is, as an example, not all of the dollar value of a particular technology, energy storage. I'm looking at Sean back there. He knows the value stack of energy storage so well, but even distributed solar are really easy to access because the value of energy is distributed across wholesale, retail, T&D, all these different sides, and to try to make that economic. So the more that we can open up those different market values for a particular technology, there's a battle at FERC right now, ISO New England, to give more value to what FERC required under 2222 to distribute energy resources. We could unlock that extra market value efficiently to be able to be put to work for these technologies. The real value of solar on my roof to the grid, being able to come back to me as the solar owner of the house, that would help. So that's the second after concessionary. The third is just the world of government, whether it's the carrot or the stick, incentives or penalties. They work fantastic. And to answer your question, what do we need is we need stability in all of this, right? IRA was great. I cannot tell you how much of my day is spent trying to answer questions for these building owners of how do I unlock those dollars in IRA? And I can't even understand necessarily. As an expert in this field, I can't clearly lay it out for them because it's very, very complicated and it's technology dependent, and some of it might come, or we got to wait for the states to tell us how they're going to use the funding. There's billions of dollars there, but I'm not quite sure how it's going to help you on your particular project. It's very, very complex. So we need clarity rather than the challenge of policy and incentive world is always just complexity is what happens. So more stability, more simplicity on the incentive, but also I think we're getting to the point where we need to be realistic and that we need to have penalties, or I think John basically saying regulatory policy wise, we need to have if anyone's familiar with the city of Boston and their BERTA requirements, has been the biggest boon for what I've seen in our membership of building owners deciding to go to net zero because they have to. And now it is cheaper for them to go buy into a utility scale solar or wind project or decarbonize their building with individual projects at the building level than to pay that penalty that Boston's going to charge them. Thank you, Steve, for that.
Well,
Yeah, and Stephen, back to you. So what are some of the specific opportunities the IRA creates for states and also for cities, right? But I know one is the green opportunity for Green Bank, but what are some other opportunities, specific opportunities? Yes.
Sure. Just on that point, one opportunity that I think has gotten a lot of attention across the country is a particular program in IRA called Title 17, which is meant for municipalities and states to be able to scale financing, accessing federal loan program office loan guarantees. The process itself is can be very complex, and it's meant to help innovative emerging technologies, as well as commercialized proven technologies. And so I think it was announced early last year, and I think there's been a lot of effort to try to dissect it. And just recently, over the last couple of months, in fact, over the last couple of weeks, 7 states have come forward with requests for information from the private sector. These programs are designed to help municipalities and states promote access to low-cost U.S. government guaranteed loan guarantees, but they have to follow with the particular rules that are designed to help encourage adoption of some of these technologies. So if you were to, look it up, you would see that within the last month or so, 6, 7 states have come forward, and I think City of Boston, along working closely with the state, are trying to figure it out, and so that is one IRIS specific program. There's also for everything that's been mentioned by my fellow panelists, City of Boston is naturally looking at all the grant opportunities that exist. City's carbon footprint is dominated by buildings and transportation. And so we are working to access both grant funding as well as these loan guarantee loan financing programs. And to date, there actually on our website, there is a dashboard that is tracking the activity of the city called the Green New Deal dashboard. It's still in beta form, but I think it will give you a sense as to kind of the scope and scale of existing financing and funding programs by sector. And happy to share that website with anybody that's interested. But I think Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer, and happy to share more specifics, because we've actually, one project that I'll highlight was in the news just earlier this week involving electric vehicle charging curbside infrastructure, both publicly owned and operated, as well as privately owned and operated. And so I think it gets to the issue that the city wants to create accessibility and affordability for some of these clean technologies, and electrification naturally of transportation requires access to charging. And so I think we're trying to create the means to help citizens of Boston access some of these technologies.
Good. And Greg, let me ask you specific questions and you can add that to it. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the key challenges you mentioned in your introductory remark was about racial or income inequality or income gap, right? How do we address this? And I know you've created the environmental justice impact scoring system. How is that working to take away this obstacle as far as financing the energy transition in the US is concerned?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Just a couple data points for everybody in the audience. So I assume everybody will raise their hands. Have you heard about environmental justice? Okay. And have you heard about how Massachusetts defines environmental justice by chance? Okay, so I think one kind of a quirk is in Massachusetts is we define environmental justice communities by demographic data. So it's essentially based on income, race, or the language you speak. It has nothing to do with any environmental damage that's actually been done to a community. And so we have primarily Black communities that have significant environmental damage, 10-year mortality rate difference between living in Back Bay or living in Grove Hall, which is a Black neighborhood in Roxbury, the poorest neighborhood. It's got 3% of the land mass and 38% of brownfields, and significant vacant property, high crime, mental health problems, et cetera. And so the work I've been doing around environmental justice is to develop a new system. I call it the Green Zone Planning Framework. It's really a system that looks at public health data, at emissions data, and project data, and seeks to score communities in terms of who's been damaged the most. But the idea that money coming from these federal grants should be directed and prioritized towards communities that have been damaged the most. And so the Environmental Justice Index is a system that evaluates every square mile of Massachusetts. It looks at public health data like asthma rates, mortality rates, looks at emission data from buildings, transportation, looks at things like energy burden, and it computes a score using the impact rate of return. And we're developing this primarily because we're looking to help program designers and policymakers direct funding where it should go. I mean, what triggered my interest in working on this was a announcement by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs that they had given this island in Nantucket $250,000 for food insecurity. Now, if you can imagine, there's not, of course, there's probably food insecurity with immigrant workers on Nantucket, but Nantucket has all the means in the world to fix it on its own. It doesn't need public funds to do that. But that's what's happening in Massachusetts. 200 out of the 350 communities in Massachusetts are considered EJ communities. If you look at the data, money's going to Lexington and Wellesley and other places, and not to Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, where it's actually desperately needed. And a lot of this is really about us recognizing how to best prioritize these precious federal dollars and make certain that they're directed. And I did want to just make a point about the IRA. And these are really great points that have been made by my fellow panelists. So the IRA is great, I mean, in terms of scale and large scale projects, but it also has some benefits for small communities. Recently started something called the Boston Community Solar Cooperative. It's an effort or a movement to have community owned all of this new solar that we need to put on. And the ability for something like the Boston Community Solar Cooperative to exist is really founded in the fact that we can take tax credits that we qualify for being, in a low income community or paying a prevailing wage. And we can actually sell those tax credits as a way to finance projects. And this didn't exactly happen. Historically, in order to use tax credit funding, you'd have to have the owner of the tax credit own the property for some period of time. So we couldn't literally give it to a community. So with these new regulations in place, we now have an opportunity to have community-owned solar where the community gets the benefit of selling the electricity, being able to determine who gets the jobs, and also being in a position to look at how those projects can be deployed in their community for maximum benefit. And best of all, every day the sun shines, they get a check from the passive income from the profits in a cooperative, model. So there are some new tools that are been created by the IRA that does allow for projects that historically would not be possible for a community because of the amount of capital. And I think that's really a positive thing that we should be thankful for. And, hopefully the IRA won't be reversed in the next presidential election.
I was just going to add on that, the EPA has the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is significant in size and scope, and really kind of goes to the point that Greg mentioned, seeking to distribute that capital through nonprofits and CDFIs is I think a key opportunity for community-focused projects, and we are naturally looking at it closely.
Okay, great. We can now open up to questions, comment. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I'm Sean Becker. I'm both a former grad student and consultant, current consultant, but a lot of the talk I hear everybody sort of saying that there is a pool of capital. My experience, there's billions of capital that wants to get into clean tech, environmental projects, but the friction of getting those out is tremendous. You know, the consultant, Grad Student Full Employment Act is how Massachusetts approach its policy making. And you see some of that at the federal level with the production requirements for car insurance. And then when you get to the built environment, things that are not commodities, but are more project-based, more idiosyncratic, as John was saying, to each and every house being different. How do you unlock that capital? At what level is the lever of policy going to be changed? Is it going to be at the city level, the state level? We have almost $700 billion in rate-based dollars for mass save, but very hard to access, especially for EJ communities, or the federal level, where you still need tax accountants, you need 25-year projects that bank out at commercial return rates. What level, federal, state, or city, or nonprofit, are you going to pull? And where should these people in the room go out forth, conquer the next 5 years?
Yeah,
I'll put
yeah,
my-
John, okay.
Well, can I just put a wish out there that it happens at least at the state? Federal is probably too pie in the sky to wish for that. I think at the state level, at the local level, it becomes very, very challenging for the energy experts to help the building owners. Berto is great, but if we have 351 Bertos across this state, it's a real waste of resources. So we have the specialized stretch code now in Massachusetts, which is a great start, but that only addresses new construction. So my hope is that the policy is at the state level at least. Next election, maybe we can get to federal, but
Yeah, John.
So this group is comprised of a lot of people from a lot of different countries. So the U.S. experience is somewhat unique in that we love doing stuff through the tax code. When we want to incentivize something, it's far easier to put in a tax credit or a tax abatement through the tax code than simply appropriate the money. Over in Europe, other way around. They just mandate a high price and you get a lot of renewable power installed in Germany or in Spain. There are advantages and disadvantages. So the key is for you, if you're going to whatever the country you're going to or working on, is understanding what works in that environment. What is the lever that seems to resonate when policy is in favor of supporting a given sector? And you have to work with that. We're not going to be able to reinvent the ethos in this country where we're trying to do something and we're not telling anybody about it. We're just going to bury it under, the tax code. I agree. It's at the state level here in the US. It's also at the utility level, I would argue, but they're nested together. Utilities won't do anything unless they're mandated. They're private sector entities. They do things for a return. They're regulated, but they do it to maximize the return. We've got the advantage in that they have to do it under a regulation framework. So if you change the regulations, say go forth and set up a aggregated program for installing heat pumps in every town or in every house along the way, they will do that because they're told to do that. So I think it is a nested area, but it's a matter of identifying what the levers are in the country that you're working at and figuring out, okay, start small and then work way upwards. If you start at the top, it's just harder and you risk delays in trying to have the perfect being the enemy of the good enough, or the good enough being the enemy of the perfect. You never get the order straight.
Yeah,
With
Steve,
that
you wanna
phrase.
have a
I was
bite
just
to
gonna
it and then-
chime in,
Yeah.
lastly on that point, the best example of, to exemplify, John's point there, here locally, is, recent utility engagement on geothermal power, which is extremely exciting. I think, much stems from, I think, leadership at the state level with DPU announcing, their agenda to get off of gas, and Eversource and their projects in Framingham, and National Grid recently announced a project with the Boston Housing Authority. I think gives me a lot of hope and excitement, and that's an example of change happening at the state level, led through the DPU translating into public-private partnerships with cities and technology companies, geothermal technology companies.
Good. Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. Yep.
Hi, my name is Fabio. I am a operational analyst at Public Relations. first of all, thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello, there you go. So Fabio from Accent Public Relations. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on these topics. I've learned a lot, especially the importance of stability and policy for mobilizing finance, especially for these under-resourced communities. However, I also realize that in Massachusetts, we are rather privileged in a bubble that does support all of these policies and these financing. Boston is probably one of the best cities in America for this industry. So my question to you, especially in an era of increasingly polarized policy where one administration can completely edit the EPA website to remove any mention of climate change, and then the next administration puts it back there. How have y'all, in your experience, overcome these obstacles in policy, whether it's in lack of support or in its instability?
So there was a recent move by the EPA that I thought originally was highly duplicative. So there's something called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. It's a program. It's well endowed with billions of dollars. And they decided that there would be two eligible entry. One would be metropolitan area districts, and the other would be the state. And I said, well, why on earth would they have people do climate action plans at both levels? And it was partly because they knew that certain states like Texas and others wouldn't apply as a state, but regions like Austin and Houston would. So what they ended up doing is they created a system, a policy framework that allowed for those states that would never, because there was a quote unquote climate to start to the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund, they decided to package it that way, which I thought was actually quite brilliant, because ultimately we see that what we expected to happen, certain states did not apply, but certain regions within those states did. And I think those are the kinds of policy realities that we have to, recognize when, we have, half the country who believes climate change is not happening.
Yeah, Fabio, I think to add on to it, sometimes it's a matter of reframing this. If somebody has a polarized view about climate change is not happening, it's not real, et cetera, it's fruitless to try and convince them otherwise. On the other hand, if you bring jobs to your state, people are less concerned about why the job is coming there because they see an opportunity to provide for their families. So state of Georgia has reaped huge benefits under the IRA for bringing EV manufacturing, EV battery manufacturing, EV battery recycling plants to their state. Billions of dollars of investment or capital. Has nothing to do with the politics, has everything to do about jobs and taking advantage of the possibilities. Another example, state of Texas. Earlier this month, for a couple of day period, 80% of Texas's grid, their requirements were serviced by renewables. They're the largest generator of renewable power in the country. Now, big state, fine, but they had enormous success in doing this. So, bonus points. Can anyone name the governor of Texas who started that process? And what party was he from? There's a clue there. Ding, 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 ding. George Bush, when he was governor, signed legislation that really kicked off Texas renewable power. Up to then, it was California. Now Texas by a long shot. You think of California as doing it all, but no, Texas, far larger. Versus wind, now it's solar. They've created an environment where generation is happening. So reframe it. Move it away from the emotive words and get it into stuff that people want to hear.
And I was just going to chime in on that, kind of to John's point and to Kevin's point earlier. I think a significant portion of the funding has gone to red states. I think here locally, there have been a handful of examples of climate tech startups that have created facilities in West Virginia. And so I think that kind of points to, some of the job creation benefits that is so key to appreciating the climate transition. even in red states.
For the sake of time, I think we can take how many questions? One or two? Okay, one more. So maybe we do two.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here today. My name's Ryan. I'm a current undergrad at Tufts. This is a question specifically targeted for you, John, but I'd be happy to hear from everyone. I'm really interested in climate tech from the funding and investment perspective. Could you talk a little bit about what your career has looked like and any recommendations you'd give to get into a position like yours?
I'm a Fletcher grad, so that's a start. So come to Fletcher. It's a plug. It may be as simplest as be an omnivore. Take all the information you have and go after more. Fletcher's training was not on becoming an engineer, a physicist, chemist, et cetera. There are now programs here that tie in joint degree programs more and more. It's more, for me, it was asking questions. From Fletcher, I went to work for the federal government. I was a presidential management intern. I went to work for an agency that's now called the International Development Finance Corporation. Back in the day, it had a different name, but it was doing project financing. Learned lots of different sectors. You learned the techniques of how you think about projects, how to ask questions, what's the information you need, what are the squishy parts of someone's proposal, and how do you unearth that? And then deciding ultimately, what's the risk? What are the risks, and are you comfortable with that? So getting in a career that we talked earlier, there's a lot of money flowing. That means there are a lot of jobs for people who are trying to move that money. And it's a matter of identifying that sector, that area that you're interested in, and just drilling and finding who the people are, going to the conferences. They're desperate for people who understand, because there's so much lingo. We've been spouting off lingo at you all day here. So if you can learn the lingo, that's an advantage. It's a downside for barriers to entry, but that's the name of the game.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you. I forget who touched on this earlier, but oh, sorry, my name's Kayla. Nice to meet you. I forget who touched on this earlier, but someone mentioned how there's a lot of early stage funding for climate startups now. And we've really seen a lot of that funding continue to drift towards early stage companies while climate tech has been building up, and there are companies that are now building entire factories and really starting to get to deployment. And so do you mind talking a little bit about that funding gap by deployment for some of these large technologies and what financing that can look like from your different perspectives?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it, and I think for sure there is a deep pool of growing capital on the front end. It's the next layer of trying to identify, first of a kind project financing type capital, which is much less developed, and so to get from the venture side to the FOAK folk financing is very tricky, and it's trying to identify the project finance infrastructure partners that are willing to learn about potentially trying to de-risk some of those technologies. But really, for these startups, they have to take these baby steps, if you will, in being able to progress forward and de-risk and show their investors that their yet to be proven technology can kind of get to that level. And where the city of Boston, as we are trying to think through how to be a Green New Deal city, promote climate tech, because we believe that it is a enormous undeveloped opportunity on the Boston side, how we can work with the ecosystem. Piloting technologies is an area that we're very interested in learning about and trying to figure out if we can identify relevant opportunities in different parts of the city to be able to pilot with some of these technologies. Ultimately, if we're if these startups are able to kind of make that forward progress, they will then be able to convince financiers to develop risk sharing strategies to get to that folk financing.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting reality around energy policy and climate tech investment. So the Rocky Mountain Institute did a study recently that shows that the states that have the most progressive energy policies are actually last in terms of climate tech economic activity. And so if you think about Massachusetts, we decided to stand up a green bank, but they're called the Community Green Bank, but it's solely focused on affordable housing. And so there's lots of money from the DOE. I think $40 billion loan office has lots of funds. I think there's a lot of work a state like Massachusetts needs to do in order to take, even though we've been great at incubating companies, it's really taking and commercializing those companies and creating an environment where they can flourish. It doesn't exist here. It should, and it should be a priority of our administration to ensure that we are making these companies that are starting here grow here. And that's an opportunity that we definitely need to lean into.
Yeah, and to wrap up my final question to your, so the issue is the pool of capital is not a problem, be it concessional, be it market-based, be it at the individual level, it's not really a challenge, right? So how does the future of financing the clean energy transition in the US look like? And of course, there are no silver bullets, but if you're to stick your head out for one policy to be well implemented, strengthened, or introduced, what would that be it at the state or policy level? John, I see you're thinking, but maybe I can start with you.
I think I'll go back to my first point, the predictability, the stability of the policies. The money will flow if people have a sense that it can go forward. The renewable power is not something you finance, but sure, you could finance, pay for it up front, and never get the money back. That would be great. But that's hard to get a lot of money to flow. So if we're talking about mobilizing private sector capital, it's going to expect a return. Otherwise, it can go elsewhere. So it's having the stability of the programs continue. So if I wore a political hat, I'd say the re-election of President Biden, because then the IRA is likely to continue. If it's less political, it would be having, yeah, that's probably the easiest way to frame it. Just continue the IRA.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Yeah, I sort of would echo that. I think, the tax credits in the IRA, just being able to have some consistency, to know that those tax credits are going to persist and they're not going to be cut in a political environment, I think is right, kind of the key to us being able to sustain and mobilize the finance during this really critical phase. I mean, let's face it, between now and 2030, shit's hitting the fan already, so excuse my English. But and so we have this real window to start really trying to lean into reduction of emissions. And so any disruption that's going to be caused by politics will be hard to recover from.
Heather?
So maybe to add a new idea, concurring with the rest, but I hate to say it, but I think time is a ticking and we are getting to the point where we need sticks and not carrots. So not to get too much into it, but the carrots that we've had are way too complex for the average building owner, energy user to understand. And they usually like to degrade over time. And we're to the point where we have the technology, but the technology is not economic for them to make the decision. So degrading over time, we don't have any further to go up to the commercialization curve to bring those costs down. So we either need very stable carrots for a long term, or we need to put sticks like Boston was brave enough to put in place.
So I concur with all that. And on top of that, I think the idea of introducing, I believe in the future, there will need to be more engagement on the blended finance side of the picture. There's been a lot of talk about it over the years. It's extremely hard to implement. Concessionary capital, blended capital is something that particularly in the area potentially of carbon finance on a global basis. But I think everything that they've shared, combining both strong sticks along with carrots. So City of Boston is trying to do both. Create the supportive policy to create the right incentives, but also willingness to pilot technologies that are early stage yet to be proven. We have to naturally figure out how to do that in a smart way, but I think it's kind of a combination of all that.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
So we take a break for about 25 minutes. The next panel starts at 3.